Welcome to Fundamentals of Production Advanced Lab Caddy Project Assembly Video 3. So now we have our sides complete with the pockets basted on. We have our front and back pieces with the pockets basted on. So now it's time to start putting these pieces together. So I'm going to work with two pieces at a time. So I'm going to take one front and one side piece and set it aside. So I'm just working with these two pieces. So we want to make sure as we are beginning to assemble these pieces that our pockets are all going the same direction, because you don't want to turn one upside down and then have pockets that are upside down. So let's flip this over to the wrong side. It's a little challenging to see because we've got all of these stitch lines here and they're brighter than the dark marks. But we do have notches on the sides and the bottoms and along the tops. All of these notches are going to help us line up our pieces. So I'm going to flip this back over. I have a couple of threads here I need to trim. One moment. Okay, so I have my front and back piece, and I have my side piece. These are the right sides because this is where the pockets are. So I'm going to put these right sides together. I've got one side against the side of the front and back piece. Now before I do that, I'm going to very quickly flip this over, and I'm going to put a little pin right here at these notches to help me see where I need to line up my pieces. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing over here. I have a notch on this side and a notch over here. So I'm just using pins to mark those notches. So I'm going to flip this back over. So this is the right side up, right sides together. I'm going to line up my edge and line up my notches. So you can see my pins, this pin's just at a crooked angle, so it does actually line up really well with this notch. I'm going to take a moment to adjust the camera so you can see me matching this up a little better. One moment. Okay, let's try this angle. So I've got my notches are matched up with my pins. So now what I want to do is I want to pin along the stitch line. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to the corner. I'm going to poke my pin through just one layer at the corner and come up through the other side and make sure that I have also matched that corner and come up through the stitch line. So we did this previously on another piece, is we pinned down our stitch line, but on this piece it's really important that we get our stitch lines perfectly lined up. So I'm going to start with my corners first and pin through the stitch lines, just like that. Okay, now I can go through the other areas. I'm going to start right here at this notch. Make sure that I'm coming out through the notch on the opposite side, pinning through. Yep, I'm right on top of my stitch line. Perfect. And one more place. And right here are where all of my pockets are, so it's really thick. So don't be worried if it's a little difficult to get your pins through. Okay, so this is all pinned together. I'm going to repeat with the other set of pieces so that I don't get them mixed up. So I've got, here's the right side of my front and back piece. I'm going to find my notches, stick a pin there, do it on both sides because I'll need it in a moment. Do the same thing with my side piece. Stick a pin at my notch, just like that. Okay, so right side of the front, right side of the side. Okay, so I'm going to line up the edges just like I did before, matching my notches first, and then kind of scooting everything into place from there. Bring it in close. See, my notches are nice and matched up on the opposite side. So I'm going to go to this top corner and repeat. Go through and find, whoop, pin fell out. Find the corner on the opposite side, just like that, and pin through my stitching line. Repeat on the opposite corner. So here is my corner. I'm going to poke through. I'm going to look and find the corner on the other side. Make sure my needle comes out through that point and through my stitch line, just like that. Okay, I'm going to go all the way down. Actually, I want to do my notch next. So I've got my notch on the top side. So now I want to find it on the bottom side, right there. And line my pins up with my stitch line. Stitch line on the top. Whoop, off on my stitch line on the bottom. Shift this. There we go. Okay. So that's pinned. I've got one more place to pin, and then we are going to take this to the sewing machine. Yes. Perfect. Okay, so this is all pinned, and you'll notice what I've done is I've got my front and my sides. They're sewn together on the same side. That is okay, because when we flip them together, they'll match up. All right, let's take this to the sewing machine. So now I'm ready to stitch my side and my front together. Grab my pin tray so that I can put my pins on my pin tray as I remove them, because the way they're pinned right now is the pins are actually in the way of my stitching, so I have to remove them as I go. Now, it's super important on this step that you do not stitch along the seam allowance. So right here, this corner, that is where I want to start, and I'm going to do a back stitch right here, sew all the way down, and I will do a back stitch at the opposite corner. Do not go into this seam allowance. So I'm going to find that corner. That is where I'll start with a back stitch. Now right through here, I'm sewing through all of my pockets. It's kind of thick. Don't worry about it. I'm going slowly and carefully right on top of my stitch line. Pulling out my pins as I go. Okay, so I'm coming close to the corner here. That is where I'm going to stop. I do not want to stitch into the seam allowance. That'll be really important when we start putting the lining and the bottom of the bag together. So see how my stitching does not go into the seam allowance? You want that to occur on both edges. So we're going to do the same thing over here. Get this one pin out of the way. And I'm starting at the corner. Back stitch. Stitching right on top of my stitch line. Okay, I'm coming to my corner, and I do not want to sew past that corner, so I'm going to back stitch right there. There we go. Okay, so in the last little set of clips, I said to not stitch in the seam allowance, only on the bottom. I was incorrect. It is in the top edge. You do want to stitch all the way through the seam allowance, but not on the bottom edge. If you're worried about that, then don't stitch in the seam allowance at all on either side, and you can always go back and catch the seam allowance that you missed. Okay, so when I lined these up, I lined my sides to the left side of my front and backs. So they look exactly the same right now, side by side. That may seem concerning, but it's not. It's actually going to work out just fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up one of these pieces. So this is right side up. We've got our pockets all pointing that way. I can stick my fingers in. I'm going to open the other one up. It's exactly the same, but this time I'm going to flip it so that these pieces are right sides together. Now that they're right sides together, we're going to end up making a little rectangle. So here's a side piece that's going to attach to a front back piece. The opposite is true over here. Here's the side piece. This is the front back piece. So we're going to do exactly the same thing that we did before. we're going to match up our notches, we're going to match up our corners, and we're going to stitch down the side. Now at the bottom edge, we're going to leave it open, that seam allowance, and we're going to close up the seam allowance in the top over here. Let me grab my pins, and we'll pin this all together. Basically what we're doing is we are making a rectangle, which is going to be great. So matching up my corners. Oh, these came out beautifully. And I'm just pinning through my seam allowance, pinning on my seam allowance all the way down. I'm going to do that to both sides. Use these notch pins. And as I pin, I'm double checking the back to make sure that I'm all nice and lined up. I am. So that's one side pinned. Now I need to pin the other side as well. Match up my notches. I'm going to there's going to be some fullness right here, and you can kind of shift the fullness around so that you can easily make everything line up like you need it to. So I'm matching my corners first, right there. Match this other corner up here. There we go. My notches are all lined up because those pins are right on top of each other. Yep, right on top. There we go. Use these pins now. Okay, so I have pinned both sides. So I've got a row of pins on each side. Now I'm going to stitch this together, and let's see. This end is my bottom because if I look on the inside, I can't open the pockets. The top edge, I'm going to turn this around. If I look inside, I can stick my fingers inside the pockets. So I want to stitch through the seam allowance here, but not down here. So let's take this to the sewing machine. Okay, I'm at the sewing machine. I'm going to open the inside of my bag, double check. Okay, yeah, this is the top edge, so I want to stitch through the seam allowance on this side. That makes this the bottom edge. So I'm going to pull pins out. This is the bottom edge, so I don't want to sew through the seam allowance. I'm going to back stitch right here on top of this line. Real quick, grab my pin tray so I have a place for my pins to go as I pull them out. Back stitch, and just sew right on top of that stitch line. There's a lot of fabric right here that I'm sewing through because of the pockets. That's okay. Right. I got a little off. There we go. This is the top edge, so I am going to sew through the seam allowance and back stitch in the seam allowance. Okay, I'm going to turn this around. Now this is my top edge, so I want to back stitch here in the seam allowance first and then continue through. It's always a good idea to double and triple check before you sew to make sure that you are getting everything placed in the right location. This way you don't have to grab a seam ripper. Okay, so this is the bottom edge. I know because if I open up this on the inside, I can't get into those pockets because they're upside down. So I'm going to back stitch at this corner. There we go. And now that those sides are all put together, we have basically a rectangle. This is the main part of our bag. So now what we want to do is we want to take this to the iron and we want to press these seams to set all of those stitches. And let's go do that. All right, we are at the iron now, and I'm just going to real quick press all of these seams so that that stitching kind of is secure. Thread, particularly cotton thread, when it is heated, kind of cinches up a bit, so this keeps our seams nice and tight to heat set those. So now what we want to do, now that I've heat set all of those stitches, I want to press these edges open. but this is a corner, so that's kind of weird and awkward to do. So what I'm going to use is one of our sleeve boards. I'm just going to open this up. Oop, caught a pocket. Hold on. Open this up just like that so I can get to that seam nice and easy. So there's nothing underneath, and I know I'm not going to press anything weird. So now what I want to do is I want to press this seam open just like this. Right here at the pockets, it's really thick, so you may need to use a lot of steam in order to get it to lay flat like you want, like you need it to. Okay, now it's on the sleeve board. I can just kind of rotate it around, and I'm going to press open all of these seams. It's 2 of 4. Okay. Come on, open up. There we go. 3 of 4. And 1 more to go. And you'll notice as you're doing this bottom edge, remember we did not stitch the seam allowance. So you want to try and make sure that as you press these seams open, you press them as if they were sewn together, but they're really not. Okay, let's head on to the next step. So now we are ready to assemble the lining pieces. We have 2 front back lining pieces and 2 side lining pieces. We want to lay them out so that you have your tops facing away from you and the bottoms closest to you. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and put a pin at each of my notches on the sides. I don't need a notch on the bottom edges yet. That will be when we assemble the bottom to these pieces. So here are the notches on the side pieces. Set that aside. And I'm going to do the same thing on the front back pieces. Because when I assemble these together, we will match these notches. Again, this goes together just like the other pieces we just did. The exception is they don't have pockets attached to them. Okay, so I'm going to take one front back piece, flip it so that it is right side up, take one side piece, and lay it right sides together, exactly like I did the other front back pieces. Going to match up my notches, match my corners. Okay, it's a little off right there. There we go. And pin down my seam allowance line, just like I did before. Okay. Match my corner. Yep. And pin the seam allowance in between. Yes. Okay. So what I'm doing is right here, you can see the fabric is over the pin. If I flip to the other side, I can see the pin itself. Okay, so that's the side attached to the front back. I'm doing it just like the other pieces where it is pinned on the left side. I repeat with the other set. So front back piece, right side up, side piece, right sides together, matching the notch. Okay. Notch right, and match my corners. There we go. Yep. And pin my seam allowance. Perfect. Yep. Okay, so now I am ready to take this to the sewing machine. And just like with the other front back pieces that had the pockets attached, we can sew through the seam allowance on the top edge, but we do not want to sew through the seam allowance on the bottom edge. If you're not sure which is the bottom edge, look at your side piece. The notch in the center of the side piece, bottom, that's the bottom. Don't stitch through the seam allowance. Okay, let's head to the sewing machine. Okay, this is my bottom edge, so I do not want to stitch through the seam allowance. I'm going to start my stitching right there at the corner, do a back stitch, and continue sewing down. This is my top edge, so I can sew through this seam allowance. And then repeat with the other piece. So there's my notch, so that tells me this is my bottom. Do not sew through that seam allowance. This is my top edge. I can stitch through that seam allowance. Okay, let's take it back to the table and put these pieces all together again. All right, just with my main body pieces, I stitched the sides together in the same location. So now when I open them up, they open the same way. So this is the right side of one, this is the right side of another. I'm going to take this, flip it over so that it is right sides together, and pin along the edge, just like I did before. Grab my pins from the sewing table. All right, match up my notches and pin all the way through. Since you've already seen me do this on one set, I'm going to quickly montage through this. Now we have a rectangle out of our lining piece, and we need to press those seams open just like the other pieces. So I'm going to use the sleeve board just like before. Okay, now we have the lining assembled as well as the main body assembled. Now it's time to put a bottom on these pieces, but we'll do that in the next video.